Baruch Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Shevuos daf Daled Shevuos 4, and we're going to dedicate this daf to our Shmir for the Chayolim. That's all for the Shvuyim and Yeshua for Am Yisrael and Seis Torah. Daf yomi for Masechah Shevuos will start on 3b, 2 lines from the bottom. The Gemara has been discussing our Mishnah, which the Gemara said is when it starts with Shevuos Shtayim Shein Arba, which is the oaths are two that are four, the Gemara established that this is like Rabbi Shmuel, and it refers to lashes and cases where you get lashes, but not with respect to a korban. And the Gemara said, but we have a problem because if you interpret it that way, then Rabbi Shmuel is in essence saying you're getting lashes. You're getting lashes in this case, even though there's no action associated with it, even though it's a lav she'emo ma'isa. But the problem with this is that Rabbi Yochanan says that we always rule like an anonymous Mishnah, and this Mishnah is an anonymous Mishnah. And Rabbi Yochanan says in elsewhere that we paskin that if it's a prohibition without an action, we don't get lashes. And so therefore we have this contradiction. If it's an anonymous Mishnah, we should say that if it's a prohibition without an action, we do get lashes. So the Gemara says on the bottom of 3b that Rabbi Yochanan must have found a different anonymous Mishnah. He found a different Stam Mishnah. So the Gemara says, Elahai Stama. So where is this anonymous Mishnah that he found? He found the following Mishnah that comes from the 3rd chapter. Hai Stama Ashkach. So he found the following one. That it says in the 3rd chapter, Shevuos shelo ochel. If a person takes an oath, I'm not going to eat. He doesn't want to eat this piece of chocolate cake. He can't control himself. So he says, I take an oath that I'm not going to eat kikarzu. Or Shevuos shelo ochel. And then after he takes the first oath, he takes the second oath that he's not going to eat it. Va'achla. And then he eats it. Eino chayev ela achas. He's going to be only liable for one set of lashes. This is not directly relevant to our proof, but we have to understand this concept. The Rashi explains the reason why he only says one, because after the first time, he didn't need to take the oath. He was already commanded that he wasn't allowed to eat it from the first oath. And if you take an oath about a mitzvah, you're not going to be liable lashes, because as we state on Daf Chav Zayin, Nishbal Akayim as a mitzvah v'okiyim pater mishvuos korban. And if you take an oath to fulfill a mitzvah, you're exempt. But anyway, we continue, and then the Mishnah says, Zui Shevuos Bitoy, we're on the top of Daled Amud Aleph 4a, this is the oath that we call a Shevuos Bitoy, Shechayavin al Zedona Makos al Shigagasa Korban. This is the example where you're liable, if you do it intentionally for lashes, and accidentally for a korban, of the Yored. So we see from here, says the Gemara, Zui de Chayavin al Zedona Makos. This is the example where you're liable for lashes because you did the action of eating. Avo ochel v'lo achal. But if he says, I will eat, and he never ends up eating, well, lucky. Then he won't get lashes. And that's the proof that since it's a prohibition without an action, indeed, he is not going to get lashes. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan rules like this Mishnah, the anonymous Mishnah in Daf Chaf Aleph. The Gemara says, well, wait, milti haistam and haistam and my chazi da'avid ki haistam and ki haistam. Well, he has two anonymous Mishnahs. Why does he paskin like the second one that you don't get lashes if there's no action? Why doesn't he paskin like the opening Mishnah to our chapter? Gemara says, good question, but your question really is on Rabbi. Rabbi, who edited the whole Mishnayos. Rabbi Gufe, Rabbi himself, why does he make an anonymous Mishnah here if he's going to contradict it by the anonymous Mishnah on Daf Chaf Aleph? So the Gemara says, so hachi v'hacha. How come he said he made an anonymous hacha like this, v'hacha hachi, like over there like this? So the Gemara says, Elamikara, at the outset, Savar Lav Shein Homaisel. So at the outset, Rabbi said, like our Mishnah, to start on Daf Beis, that if it's a prohibition without an action, you get lashes. Usisama, and he made it anonymous. V'hader Savar Ein Lokanov. Then Rabbi changed his mind and said, you don't get lashes. Doesn't tell us why he changed his mind. And he made it the anonymous Mishnah. And he kept the initial Mishnah there, even though he changed his mind and doesn't agree with it, he kept it there. Why? Rashi explained because even though he changed his mind, since it had gone out amongst the majority of the students, then he was not only he would never have been able to get them to forget it. Since Rebbe, uh, and he would never be able to get that out of their minds, and so therefore he left both there. And he understood, and he knew that somebody who was a good student would figure out that there was a contradiction and rule like the second one. So the Gemara says, "B'mayu kim." By the way, we should just say, how we should come to that level that we can never get a piece of Torah out of our mind. We have the opposite. I mean, I have the opposite problem that I forget the Torah too much. Not that there's Torah that I try to forget, which I can't forget. So the Gemara says, "B'mayu kimta k'Rebbe Yishmael." So you've established that our Mishnah is like Rebbe Yishmael. It says that you get lashes even though there's no action, and that we're talking about Malkos. Well, if that's the fact, Maros Negayim, the second case of the Mishnah, or actually the third case of the Mishnah, or maybe the fourth case of the Mishnah, let's just check, just remind ourselves. It says Maros Negayim in the Mishnah is the fourth case of the Mishnah, which has to do with leprosy. What kind of lashes are there? But Maros Negayim, my Malkosika. Where it says the code says berasa. Yeah, you're not allowed to cut out the leprosy. So you get lashes if you cut out the leprosy, like Rabbi Avin taught, Rabbi Eloi, Rabbi Avin, Rabbi Eloi, Kol Malkum Shenemar, Yishamar Pen Va'al. Whenever Torah introduces something where with the words Yishamar Pen Va'al, which it does, Bel Tzaras, Yishamar Chaneged Tzaras, Eino Elo Sase. So when we say it's a prohibition, and if you cut out the lashes, you're in violation of this prohibition. Yitzir, so Shabbos, my Malkosika. Okay, what about, and the Mishnah also said carrying on Shabbos is two that are four. Well, what lashes are there? If you violate Shabbos, you get stoning. The Gemara says, Lav Shenisan Lasaris being suspended. Kol Lav Shenisan Lasaris being suspended. And ain't woken up. You get death if you violate Shabbos, not lashes. So the Gemara says, Mishim Hachi Kamukimna Rabbi Shmuel. And that's exactly the reason why we established that our mitzvah is like Rabbi Shmuel. The Amar Lav Shenitan Lasaris Misasbezin. Woken up. Rabbi Shmuel's on the position that if you get lash, that if it's a prohibition where you could be put to death, you get lashes if you violate it, if you're warned for lashes. We had this in Makos Daf Yud Gimel. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second, or not for this point. Kaimuk Rabbi Akiva, we would say our Mishnah is like Rabbi Akiva. We can't say our Mishnah is like Rabbi Akiva because we said Yedios, that our Mishnah, which talks about that if you have a Dios Atuma and then you have a Hawama, and then you have another idea, you would get lashes. But Rabbi Kiva says that you don't get lashes for if you forgot that this was sacred food, or if you forgot that this was the base of Mikdash. So our Mishnah is inconsistent with Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara says. Hakashi Dias, Lav Amras Rabbi Shmoli or Malkos. So the Gemara says that this issue, Lav Amras, didn't we say that our mission is like Rabbi Yishmael with respect to Malkos? So when Rabbi Akiva says you don't get lashes, when Rabbi Akiva says you're not chayav for halamos about Kodesh and Mikdash, that's as it relates to carbon. But we said that it's talking about it's talking about lashes. And so therefore, Rabbi Akiva would have been modeh about the lashes. So Rabbi Akiva says you don't get a carbon, but he would say Rabbi Akiva would admit you get lashes if you knew that it was the Kodesh or the base of Mikdash and you were tamei and you still ate it or entered in. Where it says well, if that's the case, we have a fundamental problem. Yedios, why did it say that there are knowledge of Tumah, which implies you forgot it, which gives you a carbon? How straws me by light? You say you were warned. You need to get warned for lashes. Where it says, hello, Kasha, that we can answer. Tani Yedios dasros. So no, we'll just amend the text. It says that you knew because you were warned. Well, if that's the case, why does it say two that are four? Why does it say two that are four? There's only two knowledge. There's only two yedios. One that you went into the mikdash on purpose, and the second that you ate the kodshim on purpose, because because you're only going to get lashes if they gave you a sra about the tumah and the isur. the Tumah and the Easter to enter into the Beis Hamikdash. And so there's only 2 cases and not 4. And furthermore, Visu, es sheyesh b'yediyah b'tchila v'yediyah b'sof, ve'elam b'intayim, halam l'malchus ma'avidite. What are you talking about? Why are we even talking about where you forgot? That if for malchus, it's intentional. Visu, arezeh b'ol v'yorin. Our Mishnah says that you bring a carbon, which is a sin offering, which is associated with an accidental sin. So all these problems make us realize all of these issues. Say that the whole way we were learning our Mishnah, that it was like Rabbi Yishmael, and it was lashes, it doesn't make sense. Elam Rav Yosef, so Rav Yosef gives a totally different answer. Rebbe, our Mishnah is like Rebbe, and he says, I found 2 different Tanaim who I rule by. Be Yedios, when it comes to the Yedios of Kodesh and Mikdash, he says there, I'm going to follow Rabbi Yishmael, that say that you're liable carbon if you didn't realize this was the base of Mikdash when you went in, and you didn't realize that this was sacred food that you ate in your Tumah. Shevuos, as it relates to an oath, Nasav La Rabbi Akiva, as it relates to an oath, he's going to follow like Rabbi Akiva, who says that you're liable both for the past and for the future. Meaning to say, Rabbi holds in the Mishnah at the beginning, like Rabbi Shmuel with respect to Yedios, and like Rabbi Akiva with respect to Shevuos. Amar Rashi, Amrito Shmaita Kamei de Rav Kahana. He says, I said this teaching in front of Rav Kahana. The Amar Li, and when I said this in front of Rav Kahana, he said to me, when I said the teaching of Rav Yosef, Lo Tema Rebbe Nasav Aliba de Tanai, the way was fairly. Don't say Rebbe is just posking in this way like that Tana, and this way like that Tana, but he himself doesn't hold like it. And Rebbe Taima de Navshim the first. Rebbe is actually explaining his own reasoning. And he's paskin, he himself holds like that. He himself holds by Yediyah Satuma, like Rabbi Shmuel, and by Shevuos, like Rabbi Akiva. He himself holds like that. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa. How do I know that you're only liable if you have a knowledge in the beginning and knowledge at the end, and a knowledge and a forgetting in the middle? Says you forgot twice. That's the position of Rabbi Akiva. The Rebbe, and so Rebbe argues with Rabbi Akiva, like Rabbi Shmuel, and says, Eino tzarach. You don't need that. Harei omer v'nelam, on the top of down base v'nelam. So Mikal the other. So he implies that before he forgot about it, he had a knowledge. So therefore, v'hu yada areikan shtei yudios. So, and then it says v'hu yada, he knew about it. And came matam omer v'nelam. So why does it say v'nelam twice? So that's to say you're also liable for tumas kodesh and tumas mikdash. So we see from here that Rebbe holds like Rebbe Shmuel that you're going to be liable. Both are Helam Tumah and Beina, and also on Helam Mikdash and Kodesh. And so therefore, we know that Rebbe is not saying he passes like Rebbe Shmuel, but he himself has that position. Now, Ashkecham b'Yedios. So we find by Yedios this late time of Dinashi that Rebbe himself paskins like the same way that Rebbe Shmuel paskins, but Shevuos the Islay time of Dinashi minon. How do we know that Rebbe also agrees with Rebbe Akiva with respect to oaths? That you're going to be liable also for an oath about the past. So the Gemara says, Svaro, it's logical to assume this way, that Rebbe, that it's logical to assume that Rebbe paskin this way. We'll take out the bracket, the parentheses. Rebbe Akiva, my time, kamachayev l'shavar. How do we know that Rebbe Akiva says you're liable to bring a carbon shvua by a carbon by also about a shvua about the past? How do we know that Rebbe Akiva says that? Because the Darash Riboy Umiyute. And Rebbe Nami Darash Riboy Umiyute. So basically throughout the Shas, there's two ways to expound, at least two ways to expound the Torah as it relates to a general rule followed by limitation. There's a klal prat, which a general followed by a specific, and a riboy umiyut, and an expansion followed by a limitation. So generally speaking, the riboy umiut, it always is the case, it is more expansive than a klal prat. And so therefore, so what's the reason why Rabbi Akiva, good morning, Jeff, what's the reason why Rabbi Akiva is of the position that you're liable for an oath? You're liable to bring a carbon if you said something about an oath about the past. He learns it out from what's called the riboy of the miut. It's more expansive. So as we'll see in a few moments. Rabbi Nami Darish Riboy V'Miyute. And Rabbi, we also know in general, is also of the position of Riboy V'Miyut. We're on 4b, around 8 lines from the top. Tanya, Rabbi Omer, B'chol, how do we know that Rabbi also adopts this basic general approach of what we call Riboy V'Miyut? Because it says in the Brisa about Pidyon Aben, about how you redeem a firstborn child from the Kohen, you have to give the Kohen 5 silver coins. But Rabbi says, B'chol podin, you can give anything to redeem him. B'chol podin b'chor adam, anything chutz min hashtaros, except for a document that says this person owes me this amount of money and I'm giving that to Kohen. That won't work. Rabbanan amar b'chol podin b'chor adam. The Rabbanan say chutz mi avadim u'shtaros v'karkos, with the exception not only of shtaros but also slaves and real estate. So Rabbi, we see there is more expansive. So we're going to say the Rabbi is more expansive because he uses the principle of riboy u'miut, whereas the Rabbanan use the principle of klal prat, so they limit more. And as the Gemara explains now, my time of the Rabbi. How do we know that Rabbi is saying? What's the reason why Rabbi says you can redeem with everything except for shtaros? The Daresh riboy u'miyute. He does this riboy u'miyut, this expansion followed by limitation, because it says in the pasuk "Fiduyav miben chodesh" that you redeem him from when he's a month old. Riba, that's seemingly with anything. But erkacha kesef chameshes shkal, something of value of 5 shekel. That's a miyut. That's limitation. Tifteh, you shall redeem him. Chazav riba. So it's what we call a riba miyot v'riba, an expansion, limitation, and an expansion. And so what does it come to include? Riba kol. So it's including everything. My riba kol miwe. So everything, you can redeem him with anything. My miyet, and what are you limiting with? Miyet shtarot. You're saying you can only not do it with one thing, which is a contract. So therefore, Rabbi is applying this principle of riba miyut, which is like Rabbi Akiva did to say you're also liable for a carbon about an oath about the past. Whereas the Gemara finishes the Brisa and says the position of the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan, unlike Rabbi Akiva, they are darshi klal u'prati. They expound klal u'prat, the general followed by a specific, which, as we said, is more limiting. Because ufiduya mi ben chodesh, you redeem him from 1 month old. That's a klal. That's a general rule. Be'erkacha kasef. Chamesh eshkalim, that's a prat. Tiftech, chazar v'klal. So what we have is a klal prat to klal. We have a general followed by a specific followed by a general. And when we have that, iyat adan el ke'ena prat, it's only limiting anything like the specific. Ma prat mefurash davar metal tov v'gufa mam. And just like the explicit limitation is about money, which is something that's movable and it's inherently cash. So too, and you can only redeem him with something that is movable and inherently money. So the Rabbanan exclude not just the shtaros, but yatsu karkos. We exclude real estate. She'ena metalto, and it can't be moved. Yatsu avadim, we exclude slaves. She'ukshul karkos, they're like real estate. Yatsu shtaros, we exclude contracts. Alpha pisha metalto, because even though it's movable, and gufo mama. They're not inherently money. They're just an indication that you could redeem this for money. So we see from here that Rabbi is on the position of riboy u'miut. And since Rabbi Akiva got to this position of saying you're liable for violating an oath about the past from a riboy u'miut, and Rabbi says riboy u'miut, so we see that Rabbi himself has this position of Rabbi Akiva. It's not that he's just posking like him. He himself reached that. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Darish Riboy U'Miyute. Does Rabbi really expound the Riboy U'Miyute? It can't be. But Rabbi Klal U'Prati Darish. We know that Rabbi expounds Klal U'Prat, and he interprets the verses using general followed by specific. And I'll show you how. Because we know that there's a din if the person is an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew servant, and then he's supposed to be a Hebrew servant for 6 years. If he decides he wants to stay for longer, he doesn't want to go free. Then he goes to the door of the Bezdin, and you drill a a hole through his ear with a martzea, which is a tool called an awl in English, AWL. And it says in the Brisa martzea, you drill a hole with an awl. Eli ela martzea. I only know with a martzea. I mean, rabos hasul vasira mechav amakadeach v'amichtav. How do you know that you're also allowed to include all these other tools, which are capable of making a hole, like not exactly what they are, but I know that basically they're similar to it. One is basically a thorn, a needle, a sharp, and other sharp utensils that you make from metal. How do I know that you can do that? Anything that you take, so that's a riboy and a miut. Whereas that's the position of Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. Rabbi Omer Martzea. Ma says no, just the all. Ma Martzea miyuchad shamateches. Just like the all is made out of metal. Av called shel mateches. And also anything that's made only out of metal. So we see that Rebbe is more limiting in this case. And what's the nature of the dispute between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda? Rebbe Darish Klali Uprati. Rebbe is limiting it because he expounds the klal of the prat. In that case, the Rashi tells us out. Well, Kachta is a klal, Martzeh is a prat, and a Tata Ba'ozno is anything that's put. So that therefore it goes back into a general rule. So it has to be the prat is therefore anything that's made out of metal. So Rabbi Darshan's call prat for Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda Darish Riboy Umiyute, and he says that includes everything. And what's it excluding? Just if you got it off with like a potion, like I don't know, some sort of like acid that you burned it off. That's not capable of doing it. So we see from here that Rabbi does not use riboy amiyut. Rabbi does klal prat, and so therefore, how can you say that he holds like in the same manner that Rabbi Akiva gets to say that you're liable about an oath about the past? That so too does Rabbi, because he says riboy amiyut when here he says klal prat. So the Gemara says in ba'alma klal prati darish. Generally speaking, Rabbi does expound klal prat. What's the reason why here he rules like Ribu Miyut? Keditana debei Rabbi Shmuel. Because here he paskins like Tana debei Rabbi Shmuel rules in Elu Trefos, Rashi says. Because there in Elu Trefos, Rashi tells us, it says that there's a Tana who expounds the verse that so tochu mikol asher b'mayim. That's a general rule. Bayamim u'v'nachalim was a prop. B'mayim chazer klal. And so and whereas Rabbi Yishmael argues with that and says the Maim is next to each other, and after that it's written the Yom and Nachlam. So therefore it's not a klal prat, but we expound that when there are two general rules next to each other, we don't say it's a klal prat, but we do what's called a riboy umiyut under those circumstances. So therefore, this relates to the kosher fish. So the Gemara says, as it relates to the Gemara Chulin, where it says the price of Tanan very small, but my shnei pamim ain't ze klal prat el riboy umiyut. That Tanan very small says, since it says the mayim next to each other twice without a specific in between, not a klal prat, it's a riboy umiyut, and so therefore, that this case is also over here is also going to be considered to be riboy umiyut and not a klal prat, because with respect to pidyon haben, it says ufiduyav mi ben chodesh tifteh. So that's a riboy followed by a klal followed by another klal without the prat in between, and so therefore uses riboy umiyut. But generally speaking, he does klal prat, and so therefore he's not accepting the same position. He didn't come to the same position as Rabbi Akiva on his own. He's just pasking like him. So the Gemara says, with the Rabbanon who argue about pidyon haben, and they say it's a klal prat, why do they say it's a klal prat and klal, not a riboy umiyut? It says specifically in the verse two klalos and followed by a prat. Amaravina, so the Gemara says, Keda'amri b'ma rava. No, like they say in Eretz Yisrael, Kol makom she'atam motzei shtei klalos hasmuchot zu hatel prat b'neihem v'dunim klal prat. Rabbanan say anytime you find two kolos next to each other, and then the prat afterwards, you put the prat in between. You put the specific in between. So the Gemara says, okay, going back to the general question we're asking about how is Rabbi Paskening, Hashadamas Rabbi Kol Pratish Dari. So now we say that Rabbi is expounding Kol Prat. So now we have a problem. Bar Korchol Kashya. We have a question in the Mishnah because there we said Shevuos, there are two oaths that are four. Now, if we expound it as a Kol Prat to Kol, because it says in the pasuk, if a person will make an oath, now, if we're going to expound this as a Kol Prat to Kol, so then there's no carbon shvua about the past. There's only a shvua about the future. And so then there are not four oaths that you're liable for carbon for. So rather, we need to say, El Shvuos Nasev Aliba de Rabbi Akiva. So that's how we get to the position that Rabbi doesn't himself agree with it. He's just pasking like Rabbi Akiva, even though he himself does not agree with it. And that takes us to that sugya. So, okay, we'll stop the recording here. And Shekoyach.